For 3,000 years, the galaxy had known only twilight. The Umbral Collective, beings of living shadow that fed on light itself, stretched their tendrils across star systems like a vast web of darkness. They had dimmed suns, two barely flickering embers, forcing countless civilizations to huddle in the perpetual gloom. On the mining world of Zarian Prime, Kethel pressed his scaled hands against the cold metal walls of the underground tunnel. His people, the Ketheli, had once shimmered with brilliant colors that danced across their scales like living rainbows. Now those same scales were dull and gray, like stones at the bottom of a dried riverbed. He remembered his grandmother's stories about the time before, when their scales could light up entire caverns with their natural glow. "Grandfather Kethel, tell us about the bright time," whispered little Zara, her young scales barely visible in the dim emergency lighting that lined the mining shafts. Her voice carried the hope that only children possessed. Even in the darkest of times, Kethel looked at the group of younglings gathered around him during their rest period. None of them had ever seen a true sunrise. They knew only the weak, sickly glow of their dying star that barely penetrated the shadow barriers. The collective had wrapped around their solar system like a suffocating blanket. "Long ago," he began, his voice barely above a whisper to avoid detection by the shadow-touched overseers, "our people could make light with just a thought. Our cities glowed like captured stars, and our children played in pools of liquid starlight that we created with our own hands." The younglings listened with wide eyes, their dull scales flickering with the faintest trace of their ancestral abilities. Even that small spark made Kethel's heart ache with memory and hope. Above them, the collective's enforcers patrolled the surface. These creatures were nothing like the beings they once might have been. They were writhing masses of sentient darkness that had long ago surrendered their original forms to serve the Shadow Masters. They moved between the mining stations like oil given life, their presence making the air itself feel thick and cold. Commander Vextra, one of these enforcers, glided across the barren surface of Zarian Prime, where her shadow form touched the ground. Even the hardy mining equipment began to corrode and fade. She was inspecting the daily harvest quotas, making sure the Ketheli workers extracted enough rare minerals to fuel the collective's expansion to other systems. "Production is down 12%, she reported to the primary node, her voice like wind through a graveyard. "The workers grow weaker, their life force dims." The response came as a feeling rather than words, a cold satisfaction that made her shadow form ripple with pleasure. The collective cared nothing for the survival of individual species. They were simply tools to be used until they broke, then discarded like worn-out equipment in the depths of space. The collective's patrol ships moved between star systems like hungry ghosts. These vessels were built from crystallized darkness, their hulls absorbing any light that dared to touch them. Captain Morden commanded one such patrol ship, the Void's Whisper. His consciousness had been merged with the ship's shadow matrix centuries ago, making him more machine than being. Today, his sensors detected something unusual. A small transport ship from the Altarian system was broadcasting on an old frequency, one that hadn't been used since the early days of the collective's rule. The message was simple, but dangerous. "Remember the songs of light." Morden's ship changed course immediately. Such messages were forbidden. They sparked hope, and hope was the most dangerous force in a galaxy ruled by shadows. His weapons charged with dark energy as he prepared to eliminate another small act of rebellion on distant trade routes. Merchant vessels crept between systems like frightened animals. Captain Yila, of the cargo hauler Dim Star, kept her fusion engines running at barely 5% power. Even that small amount of energy output made her nervous. She had heard stories of ships that burned too bright, being swallowed whole by shadow patrols, their crews absorbed into the collective's ever-growing darkness. Her cargo hold contained supplies for a dozen worlds, but she moved at a pace that would have been laughable in the old days. What once took weeks now took months. Speed meant light, light meant detection, and detection meant death or worse conversion into one of the shadow-touched servants in the deepest parts of space, where even starlight struggled to reach. The collective's primary nodes pulsed with alien thoughts. These ancient beings remembered the galaxy as it once was, blazing with the light of 1 billion civilizations. They had spent millennia consuming that light, feeding on the hope and dreams of entire species until only shadows remained. They were content. The galaxy was theirs, wrapped in comfortable darkness. Every star burned low, every world huddled in twilight. The natural order had been restored, with shadow ruling over light, as it should be, but their vast network of consciousness, spread across countless star systems, had a blind spot. In the outer rim, where space was cold and empty, where stars were young and scattered, there was a small yellow star they had never bothered to investigate. It was too distant, too insignificant to waste resources on. Around that star, a small, blue world turned in its orbit. On its surface, strange beings called humans looked up at their bright sun and dreamed of touching other stars. They built machines that burned with controlled fusion fire. They created light, not just for survival, but for beauty, for joy, for the simple pleasure of pushing back the darkness. They had no idea they were about to change everything. Earth had grown up alone in the darkness of space, but it was not a lonely darkness. It was the comfortable darkness of night that made the stars shine brighter, the gentle shadow that made sunrise more beautiful. For millions of years, Earth's bright yellow sun had poured light and warmth onto the small blue planet, and life had learned to love that light. Humans built their cities like scattered jewels across the continents, each one blazing with electric lights that turned night into day. Their ships flew between the planets of their solar system with fusion engines that burned like tiny suns, leaving trails of fire across the void. They had learned to capture sunlight in panels, to split atoms for power, to make light dance through fiber optic cables like liquid starlight. Captain Tejo stood on the bridge of the exploration ship, New Sol, watching the final checks before humanity's first jump beyond their home cluster. He was a tall man with kind eyes that had spent years looking up at the stars and wondering what lay beyond. His ship was beautiful in the way only human ships were, covered in lights that served no purpose except to make the darkness less empty. All systems ready, Captain, reported his second-in-command, Lieutenant Sora. She was young for her position, but her skills with the navigation computers were better than anyone else in the fleet. Jump coordinates locked in. We'll be the first humans to see what's out there. The jump felt like falling through liquid light. When the new soul emerged in the new system, the crew expected to see the usual sight, a bright star surrounded by planets, maybe some asteroid belts, perhaps signs of life. Instead, they found horror. The star was dim, so dim it looked like it was dying. Where there should have been brilliant nuclear fire, there was only a weak, sickly glow, barely brighter than a large moon. Dark ribbons of something that was not quite matter and not quite energy wrapped around the star like chains, choking the life out of it. Captain, Sora's voice shook as she read her instruments. The star should be burning bright. It's a G-type star, just like our sun. But something is, eating its light. Engineer Minho ran scans of the surrounding space. His readings made no sense. Sir, I'm detecting energy fields unlike anything we've seen. They're absorbing photons, heat, even radio waves. It's like space itself is hungry. That was when they received the transmission. It came from the fourth planet in the system, a world that should have been green and blue like Earth, but instead looked gray and cold. The voice that spoke was weak and frightened. Unknown vessel, please respond. We see your bright engines. You must dim them immediately. The shadow-touched will come. They always come when there is too much light. Sora looked at her captain with wide eyes. Sir, they're afraid of our engines. They think we're going to get them in trouble for being too bright. Tejo felt something cold settle in his stomach. A galaxy where people were afraid of light was not a galaxy he wanted to discover. But he was here now, and these people needed help. Transmit back, he ordered. Tell them we're from Earth. Tell them we come in peace. And ask them if we can meet. The response took hours to come, and when it did, it was full of fear and wonder. Earth, we do not know this name. But if you truly come from beyond the shadow-touched territory, then perhaps the old stories were true. There are still free stars. The Zephyrians who met them on the surface of their world were heartbreaking to see. They had once been beautiful, with translucent skin that glowed with soft colors like living pearls. Now that skin was dim and gray, flickering with only the faintest traces of the light they had once carried. They moved like people who had forgotten how to hope. Elder Zafara was the oldest of them. Her age measured not in years, but in the depth of sadness in her ancient eyes. Through the translation devices that Minho quickly assembled, she told them the story that every child in the galaxy knew, but no one dared speak aloud. Long ago, she whispered, looking around nervously, as if the shadows themselves might be listening. Our people glowed like captured starlight. We could speak across the void with our light, create art that blazed with inner fire, heal wounds with the touch of our luminous hands. But then came the hunger. Her voice broke, and several of the younger Zephyrians began to weep silently. They came from the dark between stars, beings that were not alive as we understand life, but were not dead either. They fed on light, on hope, on the very things that made life worth living. They wrapped our stars in shadow chains and told us it was for our own good. Minho recorded everything, his face growing darker with each word. What happened to those who resisted? They were collected, Zephyra said, the word carrying weight of terrible meaning. Taken to the shadow ships and changed, made into servants of the darkness. We call them the shadow-touched now. They were once like us, but they forgot what light felt like. Tejo listened to all of this, his hands slowly clenching into fists. His ship blazed with fusion fire. His people came from a world where light was abundant and free, and here was an entire galaxy that had been forced to live in fear of brightness. He made the decision that would change everything. We will not dim our engines, he declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never known what it meant to live in fear. And we are going to teach you how to make light again. The new soul hung in space like a blazing jewel against the dark. Its fusion engines burned with the fierce light of a captured star, casting brilliant rays across the Zephyrian system. For the first time in 3,000 years, something in this galaxy was not afraid to shine. Captain Tejo stood on the bridge, watching his crew work with quiet efficiency. They had been in this system for 6 days now, and every day brought new horrors. They had found mining stations where entire species worked in near total darkness. They had discovered trade routes where ships crept along at barely detectable power levels. Most disturbing of all, they had encountered the shadow-touched beings who had once been free, now serving their dark masters with empty eyes. Captain Communications Officer Hansal called out, his voice tight with concern. We're detecting movement at the edge of the system. Multiple contacts, coming in fast. The shadow fleet arrived like a spreading stain across the stars. 5 ships that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, their hulls made from some kind of crystallized darkness that hurt to look at directly. They moved with the fluid grace of predators, confident in their superiority. Commander Jihai was in her fighter when the first shots were fired. She had volunteered to lead the reconnaissance squadron. 6 small ships painted with bright Korean symbols that glowed with their own inner light. The phoenix on her hull blazed red and gold, a symbol of rebirth that seemed especially fitting now. All fighters, this is Phoenix Leader, she transmitted. Remember, these things feed on light, but that doesn't mean they can handle all of it at once. Give them more brightness than they can swallow. The shadow ships fired first, sending waves of dark energy that tried to drain the power from human systems. But human technology was different. Their fusion reactors didn't just burn with nuclear fire, they sang with it, celebrating the marriage of matter and energy in ways the collective had never encountered. Jihai's fighter dove toward the nearest shadow ship, her plasma cannons charging with brilliant white fire. When she pulled the trigger, bolts of miniature lightning streaked across space, so bright they left after images on her retinas. The shadow ship tried to absorb the energy, but there was too much of it. The darkness writhed and twisted as the light overwhelmed its defenses. "This is impossible," transmitted the shadow ship's captain, its voice like winter wind. "Light weapons should not function in our presence." "Then you haven't met humans before," Jihai replied. Banking around for another attack run, the battle was unlike anything the galaxy had seen in millennia. Human fighters weaved between shadow tendrils, their hulls blazing with defensive light shields. That turned the enemy's own hunger against them. When the shadow beings tried to drain their power, the humans simply burned brighter, feeding more energy into their systems until the darkness couldn't keep up. One shadow ship exploded in a cascade of dissipating darkness. Then another. The remaining 3 began to retreat, sending panic signals back to their masters. For the first time in 3,000 years, a collective force had been defeated in open combat. But the real miracle happened 3 days later. Chief Engineer Dongmin had been working around the clock with a team of Zephyrian scientists, trying to understand how the shadow chains around their star actually worked. The Zephyrians remembered fragments of old knowledge, stories passed down from their ancestors about stellar engineering and energy manipulation. "The chains are like a filter," explained Zephyra, her dim skin flickering with excitement as she spoke. "They let through just enough light to keep the star from dying completely. But they trap most of its energy and send it elsewhere." Dongmin studied the readings from his instruments. The star was still healthy at its core, still burning with nuclear fire. The shadow chains were just a shell around it, like a lampshade designed to steal light rather than spread it. "What if we overload the system?" he asked. "What if we give the star more fuel to burn, more energy than the chains can handle?" The plan was ambitious and dangerous. Using every fusion reactor on the new Sol and a dozen smaller devices built by the Zephyrians, they would create a ring of stellar amplifiers around the star. These devices would channel pure fusion energy directly into the star's core, forcing it to burn brighter than the shadow chains could contain. The work took 2 weeks. Human engineers and Zephyrian scientists labored together, sharing knowledge that bridged the gap between species. The humans taught the Zephyrians about controlled fusion and plasma dynamics. The Zephyrians shared their ancestral understanding of stellar harmonics and light weaving. When the amplifiers activated, the effect was immediate and beautiful. The star's light began to grow stronger, pushing against the shadow chains that had bound it for centuries. The chains tried to adapt, tried to absorb the increased energy, but there was simply too much of it. The chains shattered like breaking glass, dissolving into harmless wisps of shadow that dispersed into space. For the first time in 300 years, the true light of Kepler-4 for 2b's star fell upon the surface of the Zephyrian homeworld. The Zephyrians emerged from their underground cities in wonder. Their translucent skin, which had been dim and gray for so long, began to glow with renewed bioluminescence. Children who had never seen sunlight laughed and cried at the same time as their natural radiance blazed to life. They lit up like living stars, their bodies pulsing with colors that painted the landscape in shifting rainbows. Elder Safara stood in the sunlight and wept. Her skin blazed with silver and blue fire, brighter than it had been in her youth. "The songs," she whispered. "I can hear the old songs again, across the galaxy, on worlds where hope had been forgotten." People looked up at their dimmed stars and felt something stir in their hearts. Hidden resistance cells that had been dormant for centuries began to whisper new words. The humans had come, and they had brought light with them in the deepest reaches of space. The collective's ancient consciousness trembled with an emotion they had not felt since the early days of their reign. They were afraid. Admiral Sungjun stood at the center of the great conference hall aboard the Taigok, watching representatives from 47 different worlds take their seats. The massive human dreadnought blazed with fusion fire, its corridors lit so brightly that many of the alien visitors had to wear protective eyewear just to see properly. But none of them complained. For the first time in 3,000 years, they were allowed to be in a place where light was not feared. The Altarians were the most dramatic sight in the hall. These crystalline beings had once been dim and gray, their faceted bodies barely catching the weak light of their shadow-choked star. Now they crackled with channeled stellar energy, their crystal skin blazing with inner fire that cast rainbow patterns across the walls. Their leader, crystal singer Veltar, spoke with a voice like musical chimes. "The Vega sector is free," she announced, her words ringing with harmonics that made the humans' translation devices struggle to keep up. 7 star systems have thrown off the Tao chains. Our people remember how to sing to the stars again, and the stars sing back. Near her sat the delegation from Proxima 7. 3 mechanical beings whose bodies had been upgraded with human fusion technology. Their original power cores had been designed to run on the dim energy that the collective allowed. Now they burned, with miniature suns in their chests, their optical sensors blazing with blue-white fire. "Control networks," Severed spoke Unit Prime 7 in its mechanical voice. "Freedom protocols ... activated. Shadow-touched servants. No longer able to override our systems. We are ... ourselves again." The most surprising attendees were the Aquarians from Tau Ceti. These gentle, fish-like beings had always been peaceful, living in the deep oceans of their world and avoiding any kind of conflict. But human engineers had taught them something new. Their bioelectric fields could be turned into weapons. "We shock the shadow ships now," gurgled their representative through the water-filled communication tank. "Our children swim in electric storms of our own making. The darkness cannot touch water that burns with lightning." Sungjen listened to each report with growing satisfaction. The Coalition of Light was more than just a military alliance. It was proof that the galaxy had not forgotten how to hope. Each species brought their own strengths, their own ways of fighting back against the darkness. But the war was not just about space battles and political meetings in the depths of collective territory. The real heroes were the ones who fought in the shadows. Lieutenant Colonel Hyan Wu crouched in the darkness of an asteroid mining station, his armor systems running on minimal power to avoid detection. Around him, 11 other members of the Sunfire Corps waited for his signal. They were humanity's elite special forces, trained specifically to fight the collective in their own territory. Their armor was a marvel of human engineering. Powered by miniature fusion reactors, it could create plasma shields that turned bullets into vapor and energy fields that made their wearers shine like living stars. Their weapons fired concentrated stellar fire, bolts of energy, so bright and hot that they could burn through shadow ship hulls in seconds. "Target confirmed," whispered Sergeant Minne through the CUM system. "Shadow Harvester Station, processing light energy from the Kethali mining world. Estimated 300 prisoners inside." Hyan Wu checked his weapon one last time. The plasma rifle hummed with barely contained starfire, its barrel glowing with heat that would have melted normal metal. "Remember the drill. Fast and bright. We hit them with everything we have before they know we're here." The attack lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The Sunfire Corps moved through the station like burning angels, their armor blazing with light that sent the shadow-touched servants scrambling for cover. Hyan Wu's rifle fired bolts of miniature lightning that carved through bulkheads and control systems. His team's plasma grenades turned corridors into tunnels of blazing fire. When the smoke cleared, 300 Kethali prisoners blinked in the light of human rescue flares. Many of them had not seen true illumination in decades. Some wept at the sight of the glowing humans who had come to save them, but victory came with a price. The news reached Admiral Sung Jen 3 days later, transmitted through the Coalition's network of hidden communication relays. Captain Taeho was dead. His ship, the New Soul, had been defending the evacuation of a Zephyrian nursery world when a shadow fleet of unprecedented size had appeared. Taeho had ordered his crew to abandon ship, then rammed his blazing vessel directly into the heart of the shadow formation. The explosion had been visible from 3 star systems away, a burst of fusion fire so bright it had temporarily blinded the shadow ship's sensors. The evacuation had succeeded. 2 million Zephyrian children had escaped to safety, but the first human to make contact with the wider galaxy was gone. Sungjun stood alone on his bridge, looking out at the stars. Around him, the Taigox fusion engines hummed with power, ready to carry the fight to the next system. The mining colony at New Busan had been lost to consumed by shadow fleets in retaliation for human victories elsewhere. But for every light that was extinguished, 10 more blazed to life. The collective had ruled through fear for 3,000 years. But now, they faced something they had never encountered before. Beings who grew stronger when challenged, who could create light from nothing, who refused to surrender, even when surrounded by the deepest darkness. Across the galaxy, on worlds that had been dark for centuries, people looked up at their stars and saw them burning brighter than before. The shadow chains were breaking. The age of darkness was ending. The galaxy was waking up, and it was very, very angry. At the center of the galaxy, where ancient stars crowded together in a brilliant dance around the great black hole, something terrible had been growing for thousands of years. The collective's primary consciousness had wrapped itself around Sagittarius A*, like a vast parasite, feeding on the incredible energies that should have blazed across the galaxy. Instead of light, only darkness flowed outward from the core, carried by invisible tendrils that reached every corner of known space. The creature that had once been individual beings now writhed in panic. For 3 millennia, it had consumed the light of 1 billion stars, growing fat and content on the despair of countless civilizations. But these humans were different. They didn't just use light, they seemed to create it from nothing. To pull fire from their very hearts and souls. Fleet Admiral Yunji stood on the bridge of the supercarrier Soul's Light, watching the largest gathering of ships in galactic history take their positions. 10,000 vessels from 100 different worlds moved in perfect formation, their hulls blazing with every kind of light technology their species had ever developed. Human fusion drives burned alongside Alterian crystal matrices, bioluminescence panels, and the electric fields of the Aquarian War. All ships report ready, announced her communications officer. The stellar amplifier network is online and charging. Major General Wu Yang coordinated the most ambitious engineering project in history from his command station deep within the fleet formation. Scattered across the galaxy's spiral arms, massive human-built stations had been positioning themselves for months. Each one was the size of a small moon, powered by fusion reactors that burned with the intensity of young stars. Their purpose was simple, but incredible: to gather and focus the light of every free star in the galaxy. Amplifier stations Alpha through Zeta reporting full charge, Wu Yang announced. We have confirmed locks on 50,000 stellar targets. All energy collectors are operating at maximum efficiency. The battle began before the fleet even reached the galactic core. Shadow tentacles the size of moons erupted from the darkness between stars, lashing out at the approaching ships with hunger that had been building for eons. These were not the simple shadow-touched servants the Coalition had fought before. This was the collective itself, its ancient consciousness given physical form through concentrated darkness. Fighter pilot Junho dove, his small craft between writhing tendrils of shadow, his engines blazing with fusion fire that left trails of light across the void. Around him, thousands of other pilots from dozens of species fought with desperate courage. They knew this was the final battle, win here, or watch the galaxy fall into eternal night. "Phoenix Squadron, form up on me," he transmitted, banking sharply to avoid a shadow tendril that could have swallowed his entire ship. "Remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for every child who's never seen a real sunrise." His plasma cannons fired streams of miniature stars, each bolt bright enough to light up a city. Where they struck the shadow tendrils, the darkness recoiled and writhed, unable to absorb so much concentrated light energy. But for every section of shadow they destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. The real heroes of the battle were the volunteers who flew their ships directly into the heart of the shadow mass. These pilots, from every species in the coalition, had set their fusion reactors to overload. When they struck the collective's primary form, they became temporary stars, explosions of light so bright they burned away acres of living darkness. Captain Hai-Jin was one of these volunteers. Her fighter blazed like a comet as she dove toward the writhing center of the shadow creature. "This is for Captain Teho," she whispered, thinking of the first human to make contact with the wider galaxy. "This is for everyone who died in the dark." Her ship's reactor went critical, just as she reached the creature's heart. The explosion was visible from the edge of the solar system, a burst of fusion fire that temporarily lit up half the galactic core. Science Officer Yujin worked frantically at his calculations while the battle raged around him. The stellar amplifier network was ready, but the targeting had to be perfect. They would only get one chance to focus the combined light of 50,000 stars on a single point. Miss, and the collective would destroy the amplifiers before they could fire again. "All stations, this is Soul Control," he announced, his voice carrying across the entire galaxy through quantum communication relays. "Target lock confirmed on the primary consciousness. Amplifier network fully charged. Initiating stellar cascade in 3.2.1. Mark, 50,000 stars." Suddenly dimmed as their light was captured, concentrated, and channeled through the amplifier network. The combined radiance of half the galaxy focused into a single beam that struck the heart of the collective's consciousness like the fist of an angry god. The ancient creature that had fed on darkness for millennia suddenly found itself drowning in light. True stellar fire, the pure energy of nuclear fusion from thousands of different suns, poured into its core faster than it could possibly absorb. For the first time since the galaxy's youth, the collective felt pain. Its scream echoed across space in frequencies that no living ear could hear. Shadow barriers that had choked stars for centuries simply dissolved, unable to maintain their structure as the creature's power failed. Across the galaxy, suns that had been dim for thousands of years suddenly blazed with renewed fire. On worlds that had known only twilight, people emerged from underground cities to stare in wonder at the bright sky above. Zephyrian children glowed like living stars. Catholic miners saw their scales shimmer with rainbow colors for the first time in their lives. Even the mechanical beings of Proxima 7 seemed to stand taller as their fusion cores hummed with unlimited power. Admiral Yu received the transmission from Earth, just as the last of the shadow tendrils dissolved into harmless wisps. The message was simple, broadcast on all frequencies, in every language known to the galaxy. The light endures. She smiled, looking out at the galactic core, where stars now burned freely for the first time in 3,000 years. Around her, the coalition fleet regrouped, their hulls still blazing with the fire of victory. The age of darkness was over. The galaxy was free, and the light would endure forever.